There is a morning in June of 1815 when the most important city in the financial world is waiting. London has been waiting for days. Not patiently. The kind of waiting that produces sweat on the palms of men who have staked fortunes on an outcome they cannot yet confirm. The kind of waiting that turns every rumor into a transaction and every transaction into a gamble on information that no one, not the merchants on the exchange floor, not the editors of the morning papers, not the ministers in Whitehall, can verify, somewhere in Belgium, on fields outside a village that most Londoners have never heard of. A battle has been fought. Everyone knows that much. A battle that will determine whether Napoleon Bonaparte returns to power in France and whether 20 years of war resumes across the continent, or whether the long, expensive, exhausting effort to contain him has finally succeeded. The outcome of that battle will move markets in ways that are almost impossible to calculate in advance. Because the difference between a French victory and a British one is not merely a military fact. It is a repricing of every government bond in Europe. It is the difference between a British financial system that has just backed the winning side of the most consequential conflict of the century and one that has not. The men on the floor of the London Exchange understand this. They watch each other's faces for signals. They pass the behavior of the brokers who move through the room with more care than they pass the actual transactions. Every piece of information, however fragmentary, however unreliable, is being processed in real time. And on the morning of June 20th, 1815, one man in London already knows. His name is Nathan Mayer Rothschild. He is 33 years old. He was born in a single room above a counting house on a narrow, gated street in the Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, Germany. He came to England at 21 with modest capital and a set of instructions from his father. In the years since, he has built something that his competitors have noticed but not been able to understand well enough to copy. Not simply a bank, something more structural than a bank. A network of couriers that moves information across borders and through conditions that slow every other messenger in Europe. A set of relationships with ship captains and port agents and road riders maintained across half a dozen countries, each of them compensated to move facts faster than the public infrastructure of any nation has been designed to move them. On the morning of June 20th, a courier in that network arrives in London carrying a Dutch newspaper obtained at the port of Ostend in Belgium. The newspaper reports clearly that Napoleon has been defeated at a village called Waterloo. Nathan Rothschild receives this information. The official British government dispatch, carried by the Duke of Wellington's own messenger, will arrive in London approximately 24 hours later with the same news. What Nathan did with that advantage, and what the world later decided he had done with it, are two very different stories. This film will tell both of them, and it will tell you precisely where they diverge and why that divergence matters. But the fact itself, the fact that a private individual had constructed a system that out-delivered the information infrastructure of the most powerful government on earth, is not in dispute, and it is the fact that everything else in this film flows from, not because it made Nathan Rothschild uniquely powerful, but because it raises a question that his era had never had to answer before. When a private organization builds capabilities that governments cannot match, what are the rules? Who decides how that advantage is used? And what does a society do when it cannot answer those questions clearly? Europe in 1815 did not answer them well. The consequences of that failure are part of this story, and the question itself, dressed in the clothes of a different century, is still waiting for an answer today. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is not a story about a hidden hand moving the pieces of history from behind a curtain. Those stories have been told about this family for 200 years, and this film will examine them directly, show you where they came from, show you what purposes they served, and show you what they cost. The actual story is more interesting than the conspiracy version. It always is. Chapter 1. The Judengasse and the education no school could give. To understand what the Rothschild family built, You have to start not with wealth, but with its opposite. Not poverty in the loose sense of the word. Poverty suggests a random absence of resources, a run of bad circumstances that might have gone differently. What Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born into in Frankfurt, Germany, in February of 1744, was something more deliberate than poverty. It was a system, a set of laws, maintained by the city government of Frankfurt and enforced with routine consistency, that defined precisely what a Jewish person in that city was and was not permitted to do. The street was called the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane. It was approximately 300 meters long. At each end stood a gate. Those gates were locked every night at sundown and remained locked until morning. They were locked on Sundays, on Christian holidays, and whenever the city authorities decided the Jewish population should remain confined, there was no appeal mechanism, no exception for emergencies, no accommodation for the ordinary unpredictability of human life. Inside those 300 meters, at the peak of its population, lived more than 3,000 people. The buildings were constructed upward because expansion outward was impossible. Upper floors leaned toward each other across the lane until they nearly touched, closing off the sky. Sunlight reached the street for a fraction of the day. The population density was among the highest of any inhabited space in Europe. This was not an accident of urban planning. It was an intention. The laws governing the residents of the Judengasse were specific and comprehensive. Jews in Frankfurt could not own land outside the quarter. They could not practice most trades or professions open to Christian residents. They could not farm. They paid special taxes that applied to no one else. In certain periods, they were required to step aside when Christians passed them on the street. The explicit purpose of these restrictions, stated openly in the legal and civic documents of the era, was to keep the Jewish population economically marginal, numerically controlled, and permanently aware of its conditional status in the city it had inhabited for centuries. What these laws produced, in practice, was not what their architects intended. When a community is systematically excluded from most of an economy, the members of that community develop exceptional skill in the portions of the economy they are permitted to enter. When people are prohibited from holding physical assets, they become fluent in financial instruments, because financial instruments can cross borders and survive political changes in ways that land and buildings cannot. When established institutions are closed to you, you build informal networks that often operate faster and more flexibly than the institutions that excluded you. The Jewish communities of Frankfurt, and of the broader European trading networks connected to the Judengasse by commerce and family, had developed over generations a sophisticated expertise in currency exchange, credit extension, and the movement of capital across the fragmented German principalities. This expertise was not the product of any natural affinity for finance. It was the product of constraint. Finance was one of the few domains where Jewish merchants could compete at all, and so Jewish merchants became very good at it. Meyer Amschel grew up inside this. He did not learn it as theory. He absorbed it as the texture of daily life in a community where the ability to evaluate a coin, assess a borrower, and maintain relationships across long distances was simply what capable adults did. His parents died when he was 12, taken by smallpox in a single season. The relatives who took him in were traders. He was apprenticed, in his early teens, to a banking house in the city of Hanover, where he spent several years learning the formal mechanics of what his community had already taught him informally. He learned to read financial instruments with precision. He learned how capital markets behaved under pressure. He learned, in the way of a young man who has very little margin for error and knows it, how the people who controlled money actually thought, what they feared, what they wanted, and what the gap between those two things looked like from the outside. He returned to Frankfurt in his early 20s and set himself up as a dealer in rare coins and antiquities. This choice was not accidental. Rare coins attracted a specific kind of customer, wealthy, educated, connected to the aristocratic networks that governed the political and financial life of the German principalities. A skilled coin dealer was not merely a merchant selling objects. He was a trusted expert whose knowledge was valued, whose discretion was relied upon, who was invited into rooms that most people never entered because he possessed something the occupants of those rooms genuinely wanted. Mayer Amschel understood the distinction between the surface of his work and its substance. He was selling coins. He was building access. The relationship that would define the first phase of his career began in the 1760s, when he attracted the attention of Wilhelm IX, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest rulers in the German-speaking world. Wilhelm collected coins. He also controlled enormous financial resources generated by a business arrangement that had made Hesse-Kassel one of the most liquid principalities in Europe. The Landgrave rented his soldiers to other powers. The British Crown used Hessian troops extensively, including in their military campaigns in the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. This arrangement produced substantial and regular cash flows that required sophisticated stewardship. Mayer Amschel began as a coin supplier to Wilhelm's household. He became, over a period of years, a financial agent. The progression reflects a principle that Mayer Amschel applied throughout his career and transmitted to each of his children as the foundational logic of the enterprise they were building together. The principle was this: do not attempt to replace the people who hold power. Make yourself indispensable to them. This sounds straightforward. It is not. It requires an accurate and unsentimental understanding of what powerful people actually need, which is frequently not what they say they need, and a sustained willingness to provide it reliably, without drama, over a long period of time. It requires the discipline to suppress the ego's desire for visible importance in favor of the strategically superior position of being quietly necessary. Mayer Amschel had a particular aptitude for this discipline, and the street he grew up on had provided the conditions for developing it. When you grow up in a community that has survived for centuries by accurately reading the intentions of people who hold legal authority over you, you develop a specific kind of perceptual skill. You learn to read a room not for what is being said, but for what is being decided. You learn to distinguish between the official position and the operational reality beneath it. You learn that the gap between what people announce and what they actually do is not an exception to how the world works. It is a feature of it. This skill, sharpened through years of navigating the courts of German princes as an outsider who needed to be useful without being threatening, made Mayer Amschel an unusually precise reader of political and financial situations. He could see the structure underneath the surface. He could identify where the actual leverage was in a relationship before the other party had articulated it themselves. By the 1780s, he had 5 sons. Amschel, the eldest, who would remain in Frankfurt. Salomon, steady and methodical, suited for the careful relationship building that Vienna would require. Nathan, the 3rd son, with an appetite for risk and a directness that made him difficult in social situations and invaluable in financial ones. Kalman, who would be known as Karl, assigned to Naples, and Jakob, who would become James, the youngest, sent to Paris. He also had, by this point, a vision that extended far beyond what a single man in a single city could execute. The constraint on any single location business, as Mayer Amschel understood it, was not capital or talent. Capital could be borrowed, and talent could be trained. The constraint was geography. A business in one city was subject to the political and economic conditions of that city. When those conditions shifted, as they inevitably did in a Europe moving through the convulsions of the French Revolutionary Wars, a single location business had no hedge. It could be damaged or destroyed by events it could not anticipate and could not escape. His solution was not to find a more stable location. His solution was to have no single location. Each son would go to a major European financial center and build a business suited to the specific conditions and opportunities of that city. Each business would maintain enough local independence to function effectively within its own environment. All of them would remain connected to each other and to Frankfurt through a system of information exchange, coordinated strategy, and mutual financial support that no outsider could fully observe or interrupt. The family would be the institution, not a charter that a government could revoke, not a building that an army could seize, not a legal structure that a court could dissolve with a single ruling. A family, 5 sons, trained from childhood to understand that their individual success was inseparable from their collective strength, bound together by something that no contract could replicate and no competitor could purchase. Before he died, in 1812, Mayer Amschel set down in writing the principles by which his sons were to operate. Keep the business within the family. Exchange information constantly and completely. Never allow any single branch to carry exposure that could destroy it without the others being positioned to absorb the impact. Treat the family's capital as a single resource distributed for operational convenience, not as separate fortunes that happened to share a name. He could not have named what he was designing, because it had not existed before. He was building a distributed network with multiple nodes, redundant communication channels, and a shared decision-making logic that allowed it to operate effectively, regardless of which individual node was under pressure at any given moment. He was building it in the 1790s, with couriers on horseback, letters written in a family cipher, and 5 sons who had been taught, from their earliest years, to think of themselves not as individuals in competition with each other, but as a single organism with 5 points of contact with the world. Mayer Amschel Rothschild did not build a bank. He built an operating system for an era that did not yet know it needed one. Chapter 2. 5 Arrows. 1 Fist. There is an image on the Rothschild family coat of arms that most people have seen without knowing what they were looking at. A clenched fist, 5 arrows held together in its grip. The image comes from the Book of Psalms. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Mayer Amschel chose it deliberately. He was not a man who chose things without deliberation. The 5 arrows were his 5 sons. The fist was the principle that bound them. Alone. Each arrow can be broken. Together, they cannot. By 1810, that principle had moved from intention to architecture. Amschel in Frankfurt, Salomon in Vienna, Nathan in London, Carl in Naples, James in Paris. 5 cities, 5 businesses, 1 family. To understand why this was extraordinary, you need to understand what European finance looked like in 1810, because it looked nothing like what we would recognize as a modern financial system. The dominant model for cross-border financial operations was the correspondent bank. A merchant house in one city would maintain formal relationships with banks in other cities, exchanging letters of credit and processing transactions on each other's behalf. These relationships operated on institutional trust, built slowly over years. They worked in stable conditions. They collapsed, often suddenly and completely, when conditions became unstable. In the Europe of the Napoleonic Wars, conditions became unstable constantly. The Rothschild model was different in kind, not merely in scale. Correspondent banks shared business arrangements. The Rothschilds shared blood. Correspondent banks exchanged information when doing so served both parties. The Rothschilds exchanged information continuously, completely, and with a speed and reliability that no institutional arrangement could produce. Because institutional arrangements are governed by contract and mutual self-interest, while family arrangements, when they function as the Rothschilds did, are governed by something more durable than either. The letters between the five brothers, now preserved in the Rothschild archive in London, are among the most revealing documents in the history of European finance. They are written in a mixture of German, Hebrew, and Yiddish, frequently in a family cipher that outside readers could not decode. They are not the formal dispatches of business partners maintaining professional correspondence. They are the letters of men who grew up in the same overcrowded rooms on the same locked street, who addressed each other by the nicknames they had used since childhood, who asked about their wives and their children and each other's health, and who wove inside these personal passages, sometimes in the same sentence, the most sensitive financial intelligence moving through Europe. A letter from Nathan in London to James in Paris might open with concern about a brother's fever, shift to a precise report on the British government's position regarding a proposed loan, include a coded notation about a gold shipment moving through a specific port, and close with time-sensitive instructions about a transaction that needed to be executed in Vienna within 2 days. The courier carrying that letter was not a postal service employee. He was a man in the Rothschild network, paid well and trusted absolutely, moving through routes chosen for speed rather than official designation. He was faster than the mail. He was faster, in most circumstances, than government dispatches. What the five brothers had built, in the specific language of a much later era, was a dedicated high-bandwidth communication channel operating in a world that ran on low-bandwidth public infrastructure. The advantage this produced was not theoretical. It was measurable in hours and days. And in the financial markets of the early 19th century, hours and days were the difference between knowing something and not knowing it, between being positioned correctly and being positioned wrong. The brothers understood something about information that most financial operators of their era had not yet articulated. Information is not valuable in the abstract. It is valuable in the gap between when you know it and when everyone else knows it. Once a fact becomes common knowledge, it becomes priced into the market. The opportunity it represented closes. The gap is the only window. The Rothschild courier network was designed to maximize that window, not by gathering secrets through espionage, but by delivering known facts faster than any competing channel could deliver them. Facts about the outcomes of battles, about the decisions of ministers, about the movement of armies and the health of monarchs and the direction of policy in the courts that controlled European capital. In the context of the Napoleonic Wars, which produced more financial volatility than any period in the previous century, this advantage was not merely useful, it was decisive. Consider what the wars actually required of European finance. Governments needed money continuously and in amounts that exceeded anything their domestic tax bases could supply. The British Crown, committed to funding both its own military campaigns and substantial subsidies to its continental allies, required a mechanism for transferring enormous sums across borders that were actively patrolled by hostile forces. The conventional banking system was not equipped for this. The risks were too high, the logistics too complex, the required discretion too absolute. Nathan Rothschild in London became, gradually, and then decisively, the primary mechanism through which the British government moved money to the European continent during the later years of the Napoleonic Wars. This was not ideology. Nathan held no particular brief for the British Crown over any other government his family served. It was the application of his father's founding principle at the largest scale, the opportunities of his era permitted. Make yourself indispensable to the people who hold power. The British government needed something. Nathan could provide it better than anyone else. By 1814, he was coordinating the transfer of British subsidies to Wellington's forces and to the Allied powers across the continent simultaneously. The logistics required moving gold through multiple ports, across contested borders, and into the hands of military paymasters in several countries at the same time. It required precisely the kind of distributed, fast-moving, multi-node network that Mayer Amschel had spent his lifetime building. For the first time, the full architecture was operating at the scale its designer had envisioned. The five brothers were not running five separate businesses that cooperated occasionally. They were running one business that had five addresses. When Nathan needed gold, routed through the continent, Carl and James were already positioned there. When Salomon required intelligence about Austrian government intentions, Amschel in Frankfurt had access to the couriers and officials who carried that information. When any single branch faced a liquidity problem, the others could compensate. Because the family managed its capital as a unified pool, distributed for operational purposes, but never actually separated. This is what no competitor could replicate by hiring more staff or opening more offices. You cannot hire a brother. You cannot write a contract that produces the level of trust. The willingness to absorb short-term loss for long-term collective benefit. The instinctive alignment of interest that operates inside a family that has been deliberately shaped, from earliest childhood, to function as a single entity. The institutional banks of the Rothschilds' era could not build what the Rothschilds had, not because they lacked intelligence or capital, but because institutions, however well designed, do not operate by love, and the Rothschild network, at its core, operated by something that functioned like love, the deep and practical variety that expresses itself not in sentiment, but in the willingness to be reliably there when it matters. Now, the Battle of Waterloo. Nathan Rothschild received news of Wellington's victory approximately 24 hours before the official British government dispatch arrived. That is established. What happened next has been distorted so thoroughly by 2 centuries of myth-making that separating the documented reality from the constructed legend requires deliberate effort. The most dramatic version of the story, which circulated widely through the 19th century and has not entirely disappeared since, holds that Nathan exploited his advanced knowledge through a calculated deception. According to this account, he appeared on the floor of the London Exchange looking grim and began selling British government bonds. Other traders, reading his behaviour as a signal that Wellington had lost, panicked and sold as well. The market collapsed. Nathan then bought everything available at the depressed prices, and when the official news of British victory arrived and the market recovered, he had transformed a single informational advantage into a profit that fundamentally changed the scale of Rothschild wealth. The historian Niall Ferguson, who spent years examining the Rothschild family papers in the archive, found no evidence for this version of events. What the evidence shows is considerably simpler. Nathan used his informational advantage to position the firm's holdings favorably before the official news became public. He bought bonds he expected to rise. This is what any investor with better information than the market would do. The profit was real. The theatrical manipulation that the legend describes was not. Why does the distinction matter? Not to protect Nathan Rothschild's reputation. He has been dead for nearly 2 centuries. It matters because the legend was not constructed by people who were confused about financial history. It was constructed by people who needed a specific kind of story. And we will examine exactly what kind of story and why it was needed when we reach that part of this film. For now, what matters is the reality of what the Rothschild network had become by the year of Waterloo. 5 men, spread across the 5 cities that mattered most to European finance, connected by a communication system faster than any government possessed, trained to treat their collective interest as more important than any individual advantage, operating by principles that a coin dealer from a locked street had spent a lifetime refining and installed in his sons before he died. By 1815, the 5 arrows were held in the fist, and the fist did not open. Chapter 3. The bankers who refused to choose sides. In the autumn of 1818, the finance ministers of the major European powers assembled in the city of Aix-la-Chapelle for a conference designed to settle the financial aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. France owed a large war indemnity to the Allied powers. Foreign troops remained on French soil as security for payment. If France could satisfy the debt, the occupation would end. If France could access international capital markets to raise the necessary funds, the process could happen quickly and cleanly. The ministers needed someone who could manage the transaction. The answer was James de Rothschild in Paris, working in coordination with Nathan in London, Salomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, and Amschel in Frankfurt. Together they managed what was, at that moment, the largest sovereign debt operation in European history, for a country that, 3 years earlier, had been the military enemy of every government represented at the conference table. One senior Austrian official, a man who had spent years watching his government's treasury strained to the breaking point by the cost of fighting French power, is recorded as having observed that the Rothschilds appeared to have no enemies, only clients. He was not entirely wrong. He was also not entirely right. The Rothschilds had enemies throughout this period. They accumulated them steadily, as anyone acquiring the position they were acquiring inevitably does. What they did not have was the kind of ideological commitment that would have required them to treat one government's enemies as their own. This is the fact at the center of this chapter, and it is a fact that has been distorted more thoroughly than almost any other aspect of the Rothschild story, in two opposite directions simultaneously. In one direction, the distortion turns the Rothschilds into cynical war profiteers, men without loyalty who funded conflicts on every side because instability was profitable. In the other direction, it transforms them into enlightened internationalists who transcended the narrow nationalisms of the states they served. Both portraits are wrong in the same way. They replace a historically specific and genuinely complex reality with a moral verdict. And moral verdicts, however satisfying to deliver, are not the same as understanding. Here is what the evidence supports. Across the first half of the 19th century, the Rothschild family became the primary underwriters of sovereign debt for the major European powers. They issued bonds for Britain, Austria, Prussia, France, Russia, and a number of smaller states. In many cases, they were working simultaneously for governments in active political tension with each other. This was not conducted in secret. The Rothschild name appeared on the prospectuses. The governments involved knew who else the family was working with and proceeded anyway, because they needed the capital, and because no other house could deliver it on comparable terms. To understand why no other house could match them requires understanding what a sovereign bond transaction at this scale actually demanded. It demanded, first, the ability to distribute bonds across multiple national markets at the same time. A bond sold only in London raised only London capital. A bond distributed simultaneously through Frankfurt, Paris, Vienna, Amsterdam, and London could access the savings of an entire continent. The Rothschilds, with their five-city architecture, were the only house that could execute this as a routine matter. It demanded, second, a level of credibility with investors that took decades to build. Investors purchasing sovereign bonds needed confidence that the issuing house had both the financial strength to stand behind the transaction and the political intelligence to assess the borrowing government's creditworthiness accurately. The Rothschilds had spent 30 years constructing precisely this credibility through a series of transactions that had performed as promised under conditions that destroyed less careful operators. It demanded, third, an information advantage sufficient to price risk accurately in environments where reliable public information was scarce. The Rothschild courier network, built for speed, also produced a continuous intelligence stream about political conditions in every major European capital. This intelligence was not sold. It was used to price transactions correctly, to anticipate political developments that would affect the instruments being underwritten, to know things about the creditworthiness of a borrowing government that the government itself sometimes did not want acknowledged publicly. A government borrowing from the Rothschilds was not simply accessing capital. It was accessing a risk assessment capability that no national finance ministry, operating only within its own borders and its own diplomatic channels, could match. In 1822, the five brothers were granted hereditary noble titles by the Austrian emperor. They became barons of the Austrian Empire, a distinction that had no precedent for a Jewish family in European history. The title was real. The practical effect was largely symbolic. The Rothschilds' actual influence did not derive from aristocratic rank. It derived from being the house that every government in Europe needed when it required capital on a scale and timeline that no other institution could provide. This is the position that the Austrian official's observation was trying to describe. The Rothschilds had no enemies in the sense that their services were needed by parties that were enemies of each other. They had made themselves, in the language of international relations, a neutral party, but their neutrality was not ideological. It was structural. It was the natural consequence of a business model designed from the beginning to be useful across political divisions rather than committed within them. Now here is the uncomfortable question that this structural position raises. When a banking house simultaneously manages debt for governments that are in political conflict with each other, what is it actually doing? One honest answer is that it is performing a stabilizing function. Access to capital allows governments to manage their obligations without resorting to the kind of financial desperation that accelerates toward military conflict. A government that can borrow can pay its army, service its existing debts, and maintain the basic functions of administration. A government that cannot borrow faces pressures that frequently end in either internal collapse or external aggression. The Rothschilds' willingness to extend credit across political lines reduced, in practical terms, some of the financial pressure toward conflict in post-Waterloo Europe. The historical period supports this interpretation to a degree. The years between 1815 and 1814, the era sometimes called the Concert of Europe, represented the longest stretch without a general European war in several generations. The financial architecture that the Rothschilds helped maintain was one component, not the only component, of the conditions that made that relative peace possible. Another honest answer is that the same structural position generated profits from every political crisis, because every crisis increased the need for sovereign borrowing, and sovereign borrowing was precisely the service the Rothschilds provided. The worse European politics became, the more governments needed what the Rothschilds offered. This does not mean the Rothschilds caused or welcomed political instability. Their private correspondence shows consistent and genuine anxiety about volatile conditions. Instability was bad for their business in multiple ways that outweighed the short-term transactional benefits. But the structural coincidence between their revenue model and political disorder was real, and pretending it was not would be dishonest. Both of these answers are true. They are products of the same structural position, operating by the same logic, producing both outputs simultaneously. The people inside the Rothschild houses were not choosing between these two realities. They were doing their work, and the work produced both consequences. This is not the most satisfying framing for people who want the Rothschild story to resolve cleanly into either admiration or condemnation, but it is the accurate one. There is one additional dimension of this period that resists reduction to pure financial logic. On multiple occasions, the Rothschilds used the leverage their position provided to advance causes that had no financial return. In 1822, Nathan Rothschild in London began publicly supporting the campaign for Jewish emancipation in Britain. The effort to remove the legal disabilities that prevented Jewish citizens from holding public office and participating fully in civic life. He did this openly, attaching his name and reputation to a politically contentious cause at a time when his relationships with the British government were central to his business operations. Antagonizing elements of the British establishment carried real costs. He proceeded, anyway. In 1832, the Rothschild family declined to participate in a loan to the Brazilian government on the grounds that Brazil had not fulfilled its treaty obligations regarding the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade. Other banking houses were willing to proceed. The Rothschilds withdrew, foregoing a profitable transaction because they had decided the conditions attached to it were ones they were not willing to finance. These decisions do not make the Rothschilds into moral exemplars across the full range of their operations. They worked with governments whose records on human rights and political freedom were far from admirable. As did every major financial institution of their era. They operated within the assumptions and constraints of a world whose values differed substantially from those we apply now. But these decisions do complicate any portrait of a family driven exclusively by financial calculation. What the full record suggests is a family that operated by a set of internally consistent principles that sometimes produced outcomes a contemporary observer would recognize as constructive, and sometimes produced outcomes a contemporary observer would find troubling, and that were not designed primarily with a contemporary observer's judgment in mind. Serve those who hold power, because capital flows where power is. Build relationships that outlast any individual government, because governments change, but the need for capital does not. Use the leverage that comes from being indispensable, on occasion, to advance positions that matter to you. Never allow any single relationship to become so essential that its loss threatens the whole. These were not the principles of a conspiracy, hidden from public view and designed to deceive. They were the operating logic of a family business, developed in a locked street in Frankfurt, tested across 3 decades of European war and political upheaval, and refined into something that no other institution in the world had managed to build. By 1850, the Rothschilds had done something that would have been unimaginable to Mayer Amschel's neighbors on the Judengasse. They had made themselves the price of power. Every government that wanted access to the international capital markets had to reckon with them, not because they controlled those markets through hidden mechanisms, but because they had built the most reliable, most capable, most credibly neutral infrastructure for accessing those markets that existed anywhere in the world. That position would not last forever. Nothing does. But while it lasted, it was real, and the reaction it produced in European society, the attempt to explain it, to contain it, to give it a shape that the existing political and cultural vocabulary could process, would have consequences that the Rothschilds themselves, for all their skill at reading rooms and anticipating developments, could not fully predict. Chapter 4: The Myth Machine. In the year 1940, the propaganda ministry of the Nazi government in Berlin released a film. The film was called Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew. It ran for approximately 80 minutes. In structure, it resembled a documentary, assembled from footage shot in the Jewish quarters of occupied Polish cities, combined with archival material, maps, and narration written to produce a single, sustained, emotional effect in its German audience. Approximately 40 minutes into the film, the narration made a specific claim about the Rothschild family and their role in European financial history. To support this claim, the film showed footage. The footage came not from any archive the propaganda ministry had assembled. It came from a Hollywood film produced in 1934 by Darrell F. Zanuck, distributed by 20th-century Pictures, and reviewed favorably by American critics as a sympathetic and humanizing portrayal of Mayer Amschel and Nathan Mayer Rothschild. The American film, The House of Rothschild, was made to celebrate the family. The Nazi film used clips from it as evidence of Jewish financial domination. Same footage, opposite meaning, identical images. This is the place to begin. Not with an abstract account of anti-Semitism, not with a survey of conspiracy theories across European history, but with this specific, documented act, because it illustrates the mechanism this chapter is about with unusual precision. The mechanism is not hatred itself. Hatred directed at Jewish people had existed in European culture for centuries before Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born, and it did not require the Rothschilds to sustain it. The mechanism is something more specific. It is the process by which a real family, with a real history and real capabilities and real limitations, was converted by people with specific political interests into a symbol that bore increasingly little relationship to the actual human beings it claimed to represent. That conversion did not begin in 1940. It began roughly a century earlier. By the 1830s, the Rothschild family was the most prominent Jewish family in Europe. Their prominence was financial, but it had become social and political in ways that were genuinely unprecedented. They had noble titles conferred by the Austrian emperor. They attended events at which the crowned heads of Europe were present. They were received in courts that had, within living memory, required Jewish visitors to announce their presence to Christians. They passed on the street. This visibility made them a target, not exclusively because they were Jewish, though that was central to the hostility directed at them, but also because they were visible evidence of something that a considerable portion of European society found deeply threatening. The existing social order of early 19th century Europe was organized around specific foundations: hereditary aristocracy, national identity as the source of legitimate authority, Christian identity as the foundation of civic standing, social position derived from land, from military tradition, from ancient bloodlines recognized by other ancient bloodlines. The Rothschilds had none of these credentials. They had no medieval ancestry that European aristocracy acknowledged, no military tradition, no land that predated their own acquisition of it, no connection to the foundations on which legitimate authority in their world was supposed to rest. They had risen through money, and specifically through a kind of money that did not respect borders, that could not be seized by local authorities the way physical assets could be seized, that operated by a logic that national politics could not fully contain. To certain observers, this made them not merely successful but illegitimate, not merely wealthy but a category error, an anomaly that the existing frameworks of European political thought had no comfortable place for. And when a society encounters something it cannot categorize, it does not typically respond with careful analysis. It responds with the explanatory frameworks it already has. European culture in the 1830s had a very old explanatory framework for Jewish wealth and power. It was the framework of conspiracy. The idea that Jewish success was not the product of capability and work, but of hidden coordination, of manipulation conducted below the surface of visible events, of an agenda that went beyond commerce and pointed toward something darker. The first substantial written articulation of this framework, applied specifically to the Rothschilds, appeared in 1846 in France. In a pamphlet by a journalist named Alphonse Toussenel, titled Les Juifs, Rois de l'époque, the Jews, Kings of the Epoch, it argued that Jewish financiers, with the Rothschilds as the clearest example, had achieved a form of control over French economic life that functioned as an invisible government, more powerful than the elected one, because it operated without accountability or visibility. Toussenel was not a marginal figure writing for a fringe audience. He was a mainstream journalist writing in a mainstream political tradition. His pamphlet was widely read, translated, and cited. It provided a template that subsequent writers expanded and intensified over the following decades. By the 1870s, that template had been built into something claiming to explain not merely French financial conditions, but the entire arc of modern European history. Wars were reinterpreted not as conflicts between states with competing interests, but as manufactured events, produced by banking interests that profited from the sovereign borrowing wars required. Revolutions were reinterpreted not as products of genuine social grievance, but as orchestrated disruptions, engineered by financial powers seeking to destabilize governments, resistant to their influence. Every major event in European history was being reread through this lens. And the Rothschilds, as the most visible Jewish financial family in the world, were placed at the center of every reinterpretation. The family's response was, for most of the 19th century, a combination of targeted legal action and deliberate public silence. They sued publishers who printed specific false claims, winning some cases and losing others. They did not, as a general policy, engage with the broader framework of accusation. They did not give interviews explaining their operations. They did not attempt sustained public correction of the mythology being constructed around them. The silence was partly strategic. Engaging with every false claim required treating it as worthy of response, which the family judged, reasonably, as conferring more credibility than silence. Partly, it was temperamental. Mayor Amschel's founding instinct had been to operate quietly, to be useful rather than visible, to allow results to speak while methods remained private. But the silence had a consequence. In the absence of authoritative, detailed public information about how the Rothschild network actually functioned, the conspiracy version was the most complete narrative available. It had internal consistency. It had explanatory power, in the sense that it could account for a range of observed phenomena. It offered people experiencing the genuine dislocations of industrial capitalism, the collapse of traditional livelihoods, the volatility of new financial markets, the consolidation of wealth in fewer hands, a human face to attach to their grievance. A system without a face is difficult to oppose. A family with a name is not. The Rothschilds became, over the course of the 19th century, the face of a system that was vastly larger and far more impersonal than any single family could represent. The anxieties of an entire industrial transformation were organized around them. The anger that might otherwise have been directed at structural forces with no clear address was directed instead at a specific family in specific cities with specific names on specific buildings. This is what Der ewige Jude was exploiting in 1940 when it reached for that clip from the American film. The propaganda ministry did not need to build the mythology from the ground up. It inherited a mythology that had been under construction for a century, translated into dozens of languages, embedded in the cultural consciousness of Europe at a depth that allowed it to be activated with images that required no explanation. They only needed to show the footage. Now, consider what the historical record actually establishes about the claims at the center of that mythology. The claim that the Rothschilds controlled European governments. What the evidence shows is that the family had genuine influence with European governments. As any institution providing essential financial services to those governments necessarily develops, influence is not control. The distinction is not a technicality. Influence means your preferences are considered by decision-makers who value the relationship. Control means your preferences determine the outcome. The Rothschilds had the first. The historical record documents multiple cases of European governments making decisions that directly opposed Rothschild interests, without the family being able to prevent them. The claim that they manufactured conflicts for financial gain. What the evidence shows is that the Rothschilds, like all major financial institutions of their era, profited from the increased sovereign borrowing that wars produced. This is not the same as manufacturing wars. The family's private correspondence examined carefully by historians with access to the Rothschild archive, shows consistent and genuine anxiety about political instability. Wars disrupted their networks, created sovereign default risk, and generated the kind of unpredictability that made the long-term relationship building their model depended on nearly impossible. They were not pacifists, but they were, structurally, deeply invested in the stability that made their business function. The claim that their wealth represented a singular global power exceeding that of any nation. What the evidence shows is that the family's relative financial dominance was declining significantly by the latter half of the 19th century. The rise of joint stock banks, which mobilized capital from many shareholders rather than a single family, fundamentally changed the structure of European finance in ways that made the Rothschild model considerably less uniquely powerful than it had been at Waterloo. The family remained wealthy and influential. They were not the singular force the mythology described. These corrections matter, not because they eliminate the complexity of the Rothschild story or render the family's exercise of power insignificant. They did exercise real power, and they exercised it in ways that deserve honest examination. They matter because the mythology is not a neutral exaggeration. It is a specific political instrument, produced by specific people for specific purposes. And the purposes have never been benign. The mythology of the Rothschilds as secret global controllers did not arise because people were genuinely confused about financial history. It arose because it was useful to people who wanted to explain the disruptions of modern capitalism without subjecting capitalism itself to scrutiny. It provided a way to direct popular anger away from structural analysis and toward a specific human target. And it found in the figure of the wealthy, internationally connected, nationally unanchored Jewish banker, a symbol that condensed multiple anxieties into a single accusable face. The question the mythology forces us to ask is not whether the Rothschilds were powerful. They were. The question is what it reveals about a society when its response to unprecedented private financial capability is not structural analysis, but supernatural explanation. When the honest answer, that a family built something extraordinarily capable through discipline and design, and operated it across national boundaries in ways that existing political structures could not regulate, is replaced by the comfortable answer that malevolent hidden forces are moving events from behind a curtain. The comfortable answer requires no examination of the system. It requires only a villain. In 1940, the machinery that had been assembling that villain for a century was handed to a state with the will and the means to act on it. What that state did next is the subject of the chapter that follows. Chapter 5. When the Storm Came. In the spring of 1938, a man named Louis von Rothschild was arrested at an airport in Vienna. He was attempting to board a flight to Switzerland. He had a valid passport. He had money. He had options that most people caught in the same political moment did not have. He was a Rothschild, the head of the Austrian branch of the family that had helped finance the Habsburg Empire for more than a century. The family whose name had become synonymous in the mythology constructed around it. With a power so deeply embedded in European civilization that ordinary political forces could not reach it. The Gestapo arrested him at the gate and drove him to a detention facility in the city his family had helped build. He was held for over a year. His release was eventually secured through a transaction that required transferring the entire Austrian Rothschild industrial portfolio, including steel mills, a coal company, and a magnesite operation, to the Nazi state. The family's Vienna bank, S.M. von Rothschild, which had operated continuously since Salomon Mayer Rothschild established it in 1820, was liquidated. Its assets were absorbed. Its name was erased from the building. Louis von Rothschild left Austria with his life. He spent the remainder of it in the United States. Most accounts of the Rothschild family treat what happened between 1933 and 1945 quickly, if they treat it at all. It does not fit the celebratory version of the family's history. It does not fit the conspiratorial version either. It requires sitting with a reality that both versions are structured to avoid. The family that a century of mythology had described as the hidden architects of European civilization, impervious to political forces because they operated above them, was not impervious. The storm came, and it nearly destroyed them. To understand what was destroyed and what survived, you need to understand what the family had become in the century between Waterloo and the 1930s. The five-city architecture of the founding generation had been an extraordinary innovation for its historical moment. But the moment changed. The rise of joint stock banks in the second half of the 19th century restructured European finance at a fundamental level. Institutions that could mobilize capital from thousands of shareholders could operate at scales that no family-owned bank, however talented and however well-connected, could sustain in direct competition. The Rothschilds remained wealthy and influential. They were no longer uniquely dominant. The family also became, generation by generation, more nationally identified with the countries they lived in. The London Rothschilds became genuinely English. The Paris branch became genuinely French. Nathan, who had arrived from Frankfurt at 21 speaking accented English, had been German Jewish in England. His grandchildren were English Jews, shaped by different schools, different friendships, different cultural references than their counterparts in Paris or Vienna. The Frankfurt branch closed in 1901, when the last male heir of that line died without a successor willing to continue it. The Naples branch had closed decades earlier. The five-arrow architecture that Mayer Amschel had designed to exist everywhere had, by the early 20th century, contracted to three primary centres: London, Paris, Vienna. The First World War accelerated the contraction and clarified its implications. In 1914, the London Rothschilds were British subjects. The Vienna Rothschilds were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was at war with Britain. The nationalisms that had been building through the 19th century, the forces that had reshaped European political identity since 1848, had hardened into something the transnational Rothschild model could not navigate. The family that had built its position partly on the ability to serve all sides found that the total wars of the 20th century made that position untenable in ways that the limited conflicts of the 19th century had not. The family emerged from the First World War more fragmented, more nationally constrained, and more vulnerable to the specifically national political forces that the 20th century was generating than Mayer Amschel's founding architecture had been designed to handle. And then the 1930s arrived. The mythology that Chapter 4 of this film examined did not create the Nazi movement. The causes of National Socialism in Germany were deep and specific, rooted in the conditions of Weimar Germany after the First World War, in economic catastrophe, in political humiliation, in the manipulation of genuine grievances by actors with an agenda that went far beyond any single family's financial history. But the mythology provided the movement with a ready-made explanatory framework and a ready-made target, a century of accumulated accusation, embedded in the cultural consciousness of Europe at sufficient depth to require no argument, only activation. When the Nazis came to power in January of 1933, the Rothschild family was not a symbol. They were people. Louis von Rothschild in Vienna, James Armand de Rothschild in Paris, Anthony de Rothschild in London, Alphonse de Rothschild in Vienna, whose art collection, assembled over 4 generations, was among the most significant private collections in Europe. The German Rothschilds began leaving in 1933, to England, to the United States, to Palestine, where the family had been funding Jewish agricultural communities since the 1880s. when Edmond de Rothschild in Paris had begun supporting settlement in what was then Ottoman-controlled territory. The Austrian branch could not leave cleanly. When Germany absorbed Austria in March of 1938, the machinery the Nazi state had been developing since 1933, the Nuremberg laws, the Aryanization statutes, the elaborate legal architecture designed to give the appearance of process to what was, in substance, organized theft, was applied to the most prominent Jewish financial family in Europe. The Vienna Bank was liquidated. The industrial holdings were transferred. The art collection was seized. Some pieces were eventually recovered through legal processes that took decades and were never fully completed. Much was dispersed, hidden, sold, or destroyed. Members of the extended Rothschild family who did not escape the occupied territories in time were murdered in the Holocaust alongside millions of other European Jews. The family that the mythology had described as untouchable was as vulnerable as everyone else in the path of what the Nazi state was doing. Wealth and connection and name, which had provided real protection against many of the adversities of the previous century, provided none against a state that had made the destruction of Jewish life the explicit purpose of its power. This is the fact that the mythology was never equipped to process. The mythology required the family to be superhuman, required their influence to be so vast and so deeply entrenched that no political force could threaten it. The reality was that they were people with more resources than most, more options than most, more time to see what was coming than most. But people, and when the storm came, it did not pause for the mythology. After the war, what remained? In England, the family had survived intact. The London branch had not been under occupation. N.M. Rothschild and Sons continued to function through the war years, managed with the same attention to continuity that the family had always applied to its operations. In France, the situation was more complicated. James Armand de Rothschild had escaped to the United States before the occupation. The Paris Bank had been shut down by the Vichy government. When France was liberated, the bank did not immediately reopen. When it eventually did, it was a smaller institution operating in a transformed financial landscape. The Vienna branch was not rebuilt. The city that had been the seat of Habsburg power and the home of Salomon Meyer, Rothschild's bank for more than a century, was now a divided city in a divided country. The Rothschild presence in Vienna ended and did not return. The Frankfurt house that Meyer Amschel had established, on the street where the dynasty had begun, was not restored. The five-arrow architecture was gone. What rebuilt, slowly and in changed form, was the two branches that had survived geographically intact: London and Paris. N.M. Rothschild and Sons in London adapted to the post-war financial world, moving into advisory work, applying the family's centuries of accumulated expertise in sovereign and corporate finance to a landscape now organized around institutions: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system, that had moved the management of large-scale sovereign finance away from private banking houses. In 1981, the French government of François Mitterrand nationalized the Paris Bank as part of a broader banking nationalization program. Guy de Rothschild, who had spent decades rebuilding the French business from the ruins of the occupation, described it as a second despoliation. The first had been done by the Germans. This one was done by the French Republic. The Paris Bank was eventually returned to the family. It was rebuilt again. It merged in subsequent decades with the London operations to form Rothschild & Co., which operates today as one of the leading independent financial advisory firms in the world. Here is what the full arc of this chapter demands we acknowledge directly. The mythology said the Rothschilds were untouchable. The 20th century demonstrated they were not. The mythology said their power was permanent. self-renewing, beyond the reach of ordinary political forces. The 20th century demonstrated that power built on capability and relationship is precisely as durable as the conditions that make those capabilities relevant. Change the conditions radically enough, as the Nazi state changed them. And the most sophisticated private institution in the world discovers that it shares the fundamental human vulnerability it has spent 2 centuries trying to transcend. Not the vulnerability of poverty. The Rothschilds did not become poor. The vulnerability of loss. The Vienna bank that Salomon had built over 30 years was liquidated in months and never rebuilt. The Frankfurt house where Mayor Amschel had sat with his ledgers and his coins was not restored. The 5-city architecture that had survived the Napoleonic Wars, the revolutions of 1848, the Franco-Prussian War, and the First World War did not survive the second one. What survived was not the institutions. It was the logic that had built them, the instinct that capability matters more than position. That genuine usefulness creates more durable relationships than inherited authority. That a network rebuilt on honest value can find new forms after old ones are destroyed. That adaptation is not defeat but continuation. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, sitting in a locked street in Frankfurt in the 1770s, could not have imagined the specific shape of what his descendants would face. He could not have imagined the industrial precision of the destruction, or the way the mythology he had watched accumulate around his family's name would be given the power of a state and turned into policy. But he had built something with a quality he understood from the first. It was not a building. Buildings can be seized. Banks can be liquidated. Collections can be dispersed. What he built was a way of reading the world, a set of principles for operating inside it, and that the storm could not take. Go back to the morning of June 20th, 1815. A courier arrives in London. A Dutch newspaper changes hands. A man named Nathan Rothschild reads the outcome of a battle that the British government does not yet officially know about. We started there. We return there now, not to repeat what was said at the beginning, but to look at that same fact from the position earned by everything that followed. What does it actually mean? Not in the mythology, not in the legend of the Jewish banker who manipulated a nation's markets with secret intelligence. That version, as this film has shown, was constructed for purposes that had nothing to do with understanding what happened and everything to do with directing anxiety toward a usable target. In the reality, in the documented, historically verifiable reality, a private individual had built a system that outperformed the information infrastructure of the most powerful government on earth. Not through theft, not through corruption, at least not in any form the historical record documents, through the investment of decades and significant resources in an infrastructure built around a specific insight. That information is not valuable in itself. It is valuable in the gap between when you have it and when everyone else does, and that gap can be engineered. If you are willing to build the system required. Nathan had seen the gap. He had built the system. The system worked. Now hold that fact alongside this one. In the year you are watching this film, the most valuable organizations on earth are not oil companies or railroad companies or banking houses. They are organizations whose primary asset is the ability to collect, process, and distribute information at a scale no previous technology has approached. They know what you searched for this morning. They know what you looked at, for how long, and what you did next. They know these things about billions of people simultaneously, and they process that knowledge in ways that are not transparent to the people whose information it is, or to the governments that nominally regulate the societies those people inhabit. The question these organizations raise is the same question Nathan Rothschild's courier network raised in 1815. When a private organization builds an information infrastructure that outperforms what any government can match. What are the rules? Who decides how that advantage is used? And when that organization operates across national borders, as any sufficiently powerful information network eventually does, which government has the standing to answer? These are not abstract questions. They are the active, contested, unresolved questions of the political moment you are living in. They are being argued in legislatures, in courtrooms, in regulatory proceedings on multiple continents, without resolution, because the frameworks that existed before these organizations reached their current scale were not designed to govern them. This is precisely where European political culture found itself in the 1820s. Looking at the Rothschild network and trying to apply legal and political frameworks designed for a world that no longer existed. The parallel is imperfect. History never repeats with the precision that clean analogies require. The Rothschilds were a family of a few hundred people. The organizations we are describing today have billions of users. The specific capabilities are different. The social contexts are different in ways that matter. But the structural question is the same. What do you do when a private organization builds something that governments cannot match and existing markets cannot regulate? The Europe of the 19th century answered that question slowly, imperfectly, and at enormous human cost. In the interval between when the question became urgent and when the answer was worked out, a mythology grew around the family at the center of it. That mythology was eventually handed to a state with the will to act on it. The consequences were irreversible. That is the cost of the unanswered question. Not inevitably, not as a law of history, but as a possibility that the record of this particular case makes visible. The Rothschilds survived. They rebuilt. The logic that Mayor Amschel installed in 5 sons and sent out to 5 cities is still operating, in different forms, in the offices of Rothschild and Co. today. But surviving is not the same as the loss not having happened. The Vienna bank is gone. The Frankfurt house is closed. The people who did not escape in time are not here. Which returns us, finally, to the question this film opened with and has been circling ever since. When private capability exceeds public capacity, who sets the rules? The Rothschild family's history does not answer that question. It is evidence. Evidence of what happens when the question is engaged with honestly, when the society that must answer it builds frameworks adequate to the scale of what it is facing. Evidence of what happens when the question is deferred, when the anxiety it produces is redirected into myth, and when the myth is given political form. Nathan Rothschild stood at a port in England in June of 1815 with a newspaper the British government did not have. He had built the system that delivered it. The system is gone. The banks it served are transformed beyond recognition. The Europe it operated in no longer exists. The question it raised is still open. And it is yours now.